United States, mid-20th century. In a country shaped by wars, mob influence, and neighborhoods where law was merely a suggestion, one man would take violence to another level. His real name was Richard Kuklinski, but in the underworld he was known as the Iceman. Some called him a hitman, others a serial killer. In truth, labels mattered little when the number of dead left behind was so high. Today, on Archives of Organized Crime, we'll travel to the origins of a man who learned cruelty at home and perfected it in the streets. Parents and early years. Kuklinski's story begins long before his first crime. His father, Stanley, had emigrated from Warsaw seeking a better future, but ended up working on the railroads with a temper as hard as the steel he handled. His mother, Anna, of Irish descent, grew up in an orphanage after losing her parents along with her two brothers. There, she experienced harsh discipline and treatment that left invisible scars for life. When Anna and Stanley met, the attraction was immediate, so was the marriage and the disaster. Stanley's alcoholism and jealousy shaped the family from the start. The arguments were violent, and physical punishment was routine. Their first son, Florian, was born in 1933. 2 years later came Richard. The arrival of the children did not soften Stanley's temper. Instead, they became new targets for his rage. For the Kuklinski brothers, every time the door opened and their father's silhouette appeared, fear was moments away from turning into pain. Their mother, overwhelmed and with no means to escape, chose silence and endurance. Richard, still a small boy, associated his father's presence with a terror so paralyzing that, more than once, his body betrayed him, only fueling Stanley's fury further. Richard's childhood was not a phase. It was a sentence. A silent school where the first lesson was that violence could prevail over anything, and that survival depended on adapting to it. The day everything changed. The 1st of February 1941. In the Kuklinski household, the usual violence turned to tragedy. Florian, Richard's older brother, died in an event that would forever shape the family dynamic. The official version given to the authorities was that it had been a household accident, and the case was never investigated. The wake was held in the family's own home, with a 5-year-old Richard, who still didn't fully understand that his brother would never wake up again. From that moment on, he became the sole target of his father's temper. School absences became frequent due to his injuries, and when he did attend, he faced bullying from other children because of his appearance and worn-out clothes. The sense of isolation grew over the years. In 1942, his sister Roberta was born, and in 1944, his brother Joseph, who decades later would be convicted of a serious crime. The household became even more tense when Stanley began behaving humiliatingly in front of his wife and children, until he eventually started a relationship with another woman and stopped showing up regularly. Religion, resentment, and survival. Anna, scarred by years of abuse, sought refuge more and more in religion, trying to instill in her children a rigid fear of God. Richard, forced to serve as an altar boy, witnessed behaviors that deepened his distrust and rejection of authority figures, a disdain that would soon equal what he felt for his father. With Stanley out of the picture, the family's finances collapsed. Anna, under constant pressure, grew harsher. During this period, Richard began stealing food to feed his siblings. At first, his mother responded with physical punishment, but over time she stopped reprimanding him and accepted his role as the main provider for the household. Seeds of a dangerous pattern. The violence he had endured since childhood began to surface, though at first it wasn't directed at people. His early cruel acts were aimed at animals, an early sign of a behavior that would, over time, evolve into something far darker. For Richard, it wasn't a game. It was a way to feel control in a world where he had always been the victim. The first step toward darkness. Decades later, while serving a life sentence, Richard Kuklinski would recount what he claimed was his first murder. He was never charged or officially linked to it, but his story was always disturbing for the confidence with which he told it. He was around 13 when his mother obtained an apartment in a new housing complex in New Jersey on 15th Street. Richard thought it would be a fresh start, but the mockery and bullying returned. With no friends and dyslexia that made reading difficult, he spent hours flipping through crime magazines he had obtained illegally. There, he found ideas that would feed his fantasies of revenge against the boys who had humiliated him. The main target of his resentment was Charlie Lane, the leader of a group that had abused him physically and verbally. Richard, thin but taller than most, carried a silent rage that had been building since childhood. On a freezing night in January 1949, he decided to act. He waited in a quiet area, hidden in the dark, until he saw Lane pass by. The confrontation was brief but decisive. Richard overpowered him with a violence that would mark a before and after in his life. When he realized the boy wasn't getting up, he understood he had crossed a point of no return. Driven by fear of being caught, he applied what he had learned from his crime magazines to erase all traces. He drove to the Pine Barrens, a remote area in southern New Jersey, where he disposed of the body and any evidence that might lead the police to him. Back home, he felt something new. Not remorse, but a dangerous sense of control. From that moment on, in his mind, anyone who defied him would face the same fate. In the neighborhood, no one connected Charlie Lane's disappearance to the quiet Richard Kuklinski. Sudden change. Charlie Lane's disappearance completely altered the neighborhood dynamic. With the gang leader out of the picture, the other boys stopped bothering Richard. That new calm didn't make him more peaceful. On the contrary, he began moving with a confidence he had never had before, and sought to settle scores with everyone who had humiliated him. He first used a piece of wood, then a baseball bat, which he carried everywhere. His height and strength, uncommon for his age, earned him a reputation as a dangerous youth. Soon, he replaced the bat with a knife easier to conceal, more direct. With it, he never hesitated to confront anyone who, in his view, disrespected him. Richard stopped going to school and began spending his days and nights in pool halls and bars, where he honed his game and started earning money through gambling. Those who didn't pay him on time quickly learned he wasn't someone to cross. Before long, he became the leader of a group of 5, known as Coming Up Roses, a name that, in the group's slang, implied that anyone who challenged them would end up feeding the earth. The group began planning more ambitious robberies. It was then that Richard acquired his first firearm, a .38 caliber revolver with a 6-inch barrel. And, according to his own account years later, it was also when he committed his second murder. The victim, according to his version, was a New Jersey police officer named Doyle, known for heavy drinking and frequenting the same bars as Richard. They played games in which Richard usually won. Doyle, under the influence of alcohol, often insulted him and accused him of cheating. One night, Richard decided he had had enough. He waited for Doyle to leave the bar and watched him fall asleep in his car. Instead of confronting him then and there, he chose a method that ensured there would be no witnesses and no resistance. By dawn the next day, Doyle was gone, and no one connected his disappearance to Richard Kuklinski. Independence and old ghosts. At 16, Richard Kuklinski was no longer the scrawny, fearful boy of his childhood. His lean build, sharp features, and light brown hair were starting to draw attention, especially from older women in bars and nightclubs. He began to care about his image, dressing better and moving with more confidence. It was in that scene that he met Linda, a 25-year-old woman, and eventually moved in with her. His relationship with his family cooled. He visited his mother less and less, harboring deep resentment toward her. His bond with his sister was practically non-existent, and his brother Joseph seemed to be following a self-destructive path. Shortly after becoming independent, Richard learned his father had shown up again, resuming the assaults on Anna. Though he claimed not to respect him, he decided to confront Stanley. He located Stanley, pointed his revolver at him, and warned that if he came near again it would be the last time. Years later, he would admit that one of his greatest regrets was not pulling the trigger. First job for the mob. By then, Coming Up Roses was already a known name in Jersey City. The group's hits were becoming bolder and more profitable, and their reputation for violence did not go unnoticed. Richard, at the helm, began to enjoy illegal casinos, alcohol, and expensive suits. That's how he caught the attention of Carmine Genovese, an influential man in the city, unrelated to the famous mob boss, but with similar weight in local illicit business. Carmine proposed they join his network, but first they had to pass a test. He showed them a photograph of a man living in Lincoln Park and directly instructed, "He has to disappear." Richard understood this was his entry into a world where money and protection went hand in hand. His companions hesitated. Taking a life was not the same as committing a robbery. Still, he got them to accept. The plan was simple. Richard would drive, and John Wheeler would be the shooter. The first opportunity failed. Wheeler couldn't pull the trigger. The same happened on a second attempt at a red light. Finally, they followed the victim to a bar. When the man came out, Richard took the gun, walked up to him, and carried out the order without hesitation. That same night, the group dissolved into the darkness of Jersey City. The next day, each received $500. For Richard, it was more than money. It was confirmation that he had crossed the line into organized crime, and that he didn't intend to turn back. Betrayal in Coming Up Roses. The Coming Up Roses gang had secured its place in Jersey City's criminal world thanks to Carmine's contracts. Each job brought substantial sums, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they had earned a reputation as reliable, discreet, and efficient operators. But with the money came arrogance. The winnings vanished into gambling, booze, and luxury trips to Las Vegas. No one thought to save a cent. Everyone believed their hot streak would last forever. Two of his members, John Wheeler and Jack Dubrovsky, made the mistake that is unforgivable in that world. They acted on their own. They decided to rob a card game organized by a contact of the De Cavalcante crime family, without consulting Richard. The problem arrived quickly. One of those present identified them as members of the group, and the news reached a soldier of the family, Albert Parenti. Parenti summoned Richard to a bar. There he made it clear that, although he knew Richard had not participated, the responsibility fell to him. The offense had to be paid for, and not with money. The order was non-negotiable. Wheeler and Dubrovsky had to disappear. For Richard, it was a personal blow. They were his closest friends, perhaps the only ones he considered brothers. He tried to negotiate, even offered to return what had been stolen, but there was no room for compromise. In that world, loyalty isn't debated, it's demanded. That same night, he located Jack and executed him instantly. Shortly after, he intercepted John as he left his girlfriend's apartment and shot him dead in the street. At 19, Richard realized that if he could eliminate those he cared about most, there were no longer any limits to what he could do. That was the point at which he stopped seeing people as untouchable and began treating them as expendable. A man aged by violence. At just 19, Richard Kuklinski already carried the deaths of 4 men. He looked decades older, broad shoulders, a cold stare, and the strength of a draft animal. On the street, rumors held that he was the one who had taken out Jack and John, and that was enough for the remaining few from Coming Up Roses to avoid him. From then on, he operated alone. In the spring of 1964, he took a ferry to Manhattan. Hours later, a man who had been hassling him for money ended up dead at Richard's hands, the victim of a quick, calculated attack. Years later, he would claim that during those trips to New York, he sometimes killed people who merely irritated him, at times dumping their bodies in the Hudson. His preference for the pistol became established, a precise shot to the ear or beneath the jaw, thus avoiding stains on his suits. He also used more discreet tools, such as an ice pick, or silent methods like poisoning. With alcohol, his homicidal impulse intensified. Authorities largely ignored these crimes. Most of his victims were marginalized people, and their disappearances rarely prompted deep investigations. A loveless marriage. Richard remained with Linda, and when she became pregnant, he decided to marry her. It was not out of love, but rather to fulfill what he saw as an obligation to the child on the way. Violence, however, had already been part of the relationship long before the wedding. In the following years, their 2 sons were born, Richard Jr. and David. Income declined. Without the gang, and without Carmine's contracts. Carmine now jailed for illegal gambling. Richard returned to physical labor, loading trucks. Still, his reputation remained intact. On one occasion, after an altercation during a billiards game with a rival as tough as he was, he left beaten but alive. Minutes later, that same man and 2 accomplices intercepted him on the road. This time Richard did not back down. He pulled a short barrel, 38 revolver, and shot all 3. The bodies were dumped in a deep cavern in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. The vehicle in which they had been traveling ended up submerged in a remote stretch of the Hudson River. No one looked for them. Decades later, he would disclose those killings as part of a long list of concealed crimes. A job with a message. After getting out of prison, Carmine Genovese contacted Richard again. This time the job was not a simple assignment. The target had to pay a high price for having seriously offended someone close to Carmine. In addition, there had to be physical proof that the task had been carried out. He was handed a photograph and an address. The man worked at a car dealership. Richard posed as an interested customer and requested a test drive. Minutes later, the 2 drove off, with the salesman none the wiser that his companion had everything planned. When they neared the spot where Richard had left his own vehicle, he asked to stop and check the engine. When the hood was opened, the situation changed completely. In seconds, the target was subdued and bound. Teed and gagged, he was taken to a remote area of the Pine Barrens, the same isolated territory where Richard had operated as an adolescent. There, the punishment was carried out with a violence meant to send a clear message. Nobody offended Carmine's people with impunity. When it was over, Richard brought the requested proof to his boss and received $10,000. From then on, Genovese made him his chief man for collecting debts and taking care of problems in New Jersey. Had he been Italian, he might have been accepted into the family. He wasn't, but that didn't prevent his name from becoming fixed in the criminal world as someone whose mere mention inspired respect and fear. No limits to the work. Richard accepted almost any paid job, with one self-imposed rule. He would not get involved in actions against women or children. Aside from contract killings, he also worked as a debt collector, transporter of illicit goods, and violent mediator when the mob needed to settle scores. One of his most notorious jobs for Carmine targeted Arthur De Giglio, a capo who had committed the worst possible offense in their world, stealing from his own boss. The order was not only to eliminate him, but to ensure that the ending sent a clear message to everyone. Richard carried it out, and in the process killed 2 associates who crossed his path. The hit was talked about throughout the criminal underworld and established him as someone capable of executing jobs others wouldn't even dare to consider. His reputation grew to the point where he received offers from several mafia families. To them, it didn't matter how extreme the assignment was. If Richard accepted it, it was as good as done. Breakup and domestic violence. While his criminal career prospered, his marriage to Linda deteriorated beyond repair. Living together became impossible, and the arguments grew increasingly tense. Still, Richard maintained a possessive need for control over her. When he discovered she was seeing another man, he reacted with brutal violence. The confrontation left the lover severely injured and pushed Linda even further away. After that incident, contact with his wife and children became sporadic. At 24, Richard already had a history of violence that made him, in the eyes of both the street and the mob, one of the most dangerous and feared men in the region. A life in freefall. By his mid-20s, Richard was far more than a hired thug. He was consumed by alcohol, gambling, and a violence that seemed to know no bounds. He continued to take jobs, and when none were available, he sought out victims on his own. Years later, when questioned, he claimed that during his trips to Manhattan, he might have killed around 50 homeless or marginalized people, simply for fun. His gambling addiction consumed almost everything he earned. Frustration and personal dissatisfaction drove him to kill more frequently. He even brutally assaulted his own brother Joseph after discovering his sexual orientation, breaking all ties with him for years. During that same period, he lost one of his main allies, Carmine Genovese, shot dead in his own kitchen. Without that connection, the flow of jobs dwindled, and debts began to pile up. Richard eventually took a job at a transport company, but soon turned it into another source of illicit income, stealing cargo and hijacking trucks. The encounter with Barbara Pedricci. He was 26 when his path crossed with that of Barbara Pedricci, and one 8-year-old Italian-American who worked at the same transport company. The initial attraction was clouded by Barbara's family's resistance, as they disapproved of the relationship due to the age difference, the fact that Richard was still married, and because he wasn't Italian. Even so, out of love for her, they eventually accepted him. At the Pedricci home, Richard experienced for the first time what it was like to be part of a close-knit family, but his possessive nature soon surfaced. Barbara, young and full of life, tried to distance herself. He responded with direct threats, assuring her that if she left him, she would endanger herself and her loved ones. The pressure and fear made Barbara give in. When she discovered she was pregnant, Richard decided to divorce Linda and searched for her until he found her in Miami. There, amid fear and resignation, she agreed to marry him in 1961. For the first few months, Richard maintained the facade of a caring husband, but his violence soon resurfaced. On one occasion, when he saw her smoking while pregnant, he reacted so violently that he broke one of her toes and forced her to sleep outside. The next morning, Barbara lost the baby, returned to New Jersey. In October 1962, Richard and Barbara returned to New Jersey, intending to leave the chaos behind. Thanks to one of her uncles, Richard got a job at the 20th Century Film Lab in Manhattan. He started with basic tasks but was soon promoted to printer. There, he saw an opportunity to earn extra money and began producing illegal copies of Disney movies, which he sold discreetly. The couple settled into a modest apartment, and soon after, Barbara became pregnant again. However, she suffered another miscarriage. Richard's pattern of domestic violence had intensified, and the abuse continued even during her pregnancies. When Barbara became pregnant a third time, the beating she received was so brutal that she lost the baby once again. Despite his promises to change, the lack of money pushed Richard back into a life of crime. He reconnected with old contacts in Jersey City and soon took part in a truck robbery, which earned him $12,000 in cash. It wasn't long before his temper caused another tragedy. After a traffic incident with two young men, he gave them a chance to walk away. They refused. Minutes later, both were dead beside their car on the highway. The birth of Merrick. Barbara finally carried a pregnancy to term and gave birth to Merrick, a girl who soon showed health problems that required constant hospital visits. During that period, Richard appeared as a caring and affectionate father, something that surprised everyone and made Barbara believe, for a moment, that her husband could truly change. Sometime later, their second daughter, Kristen, was born. But the family's finances remained strained. Neither the extra hours at the lab nor the illegal movie copies brought in enough money. When Barbara became pregnant again, Richard was already planning a major score that could solve their financial troubles once and for all. Phil Solimene. A simple job turned into a massacre. Richard and two partners were hired to steal a truck loaded with Casio watches. They pulled it off, but when they delivered the merchandise, the buyer tried to keep everything without paying. Richard didn't argue. He shot him point blank. Then he killed 3 of the men waiting to unload the goods. With the area cleared, they sold the haul themselves, and the final buyer was a familiar face in the black market. Phil Solimene, owner of a store in Patterson, where everything sold was stolen. It was Solimene who opened Richard's eyes to an even more profitable business, pornography. Using his corrupt contacts inside the film lab, Richard began producing and distributing pirated pornographic films. The new flow of money connected him with Anthony Argila, an intermediary for the Gambino family who controlled much of the adult store network in the United States. But not everyone at the lab was pleased with his extra hours and growing influence. A union man confronted him, and the argument escalated. Richard struck him so hard that when the man fell, his skull cracked, and he died instantly. Without losing his composure, Richard improvised. He hung the body from a tree to make it look like a suicide. No one suspected him, from underground porn to Roy DeMeo. Eventually, Richard left the lab and devoted himself entirely to the pornography business. He partnered with Paul Rothenberg and Tony Argila, who controlled a large part of New York's production. The deal was simple. They supplied the material. He distributed it along the East Coast, and once the profits came in, he paid their share. The business was a gold mine. Until Richard decided not to pay what he owed. He used the money to produce his own films, hiring staff for the shoots even though he never set foot on a set. According to him, those involved in the scenes were trash. All he cared about was profit. That move caught the attention and wrath of Roy DeMeo, a ruthless hitman for the Gambino family with a reputation for torture. The first time they met, Roy made it clear that Richard had disrespected him. As Richard left the meeting, DeMeo and two men cornered him and beat him savagely, leaving a permanent scar on his forehead. Though they later reconciled and began working together, Richard never forgot the beating. DeMeo hired him as an enforcer, collector, and contract killer. On one of his first jobs for Roy, Richard proved himself reliable. He executed a man with a shot to the back of the head in front of DeMeo and his crew, without hesitation. Double life, between luxury and darkness. By the mid-1970s, Richard was living a life few could imagine. On one hand, he was the family man who took his children to the pool, hosted neighborhood barbecues, and lived in a comfortable home in Dumont, New Jersey. Money flowed constantly thanks to the sale of pirated pornography, counterfeit goods, and other less mentionable jobs, allowing a steady stream of luxuries, expensive toys, designer clothes, and fine dinners. Barbara, his wife, believed she was living the American dream, even as she endured Richard's emotional storms. His outbursts could be brutal, smashing furniture, destroying the children's toys, or ripping out the kitchen sink to throw it through a window. Sometimes the violence erupted in front of the children, leaving emotional scars that would never heal. And although he never raised a hand against his children, the constant tension scarred them for life. Paradoxically, the same man who terrorized his family could be generous to strangers, handing out money or toys to poor children. He was, in every sense, a man with two faces, a kind benefactor and an unpredictable monster, the elite hitman. Roy DeMeo, a key figure in the Gambino family, increasingly turned to Richard. He was no longer an occasional enforcer. Now his main business was killing. His methods became increasingly sadistic: prolonged torture, burnings, live burials, bodies dumped at sea, or fed to scavenging animals. Richard worked with complete independence. He didn't officially belong to any mob family, which gave him the freedom to take contracts from multiple East Coast clans, including the Pontis and the De Cavalcante. He planned each hit with surgical precision, ensuring no evidence was left behind. One of these jobs involved eliminating a former associate, Paul Rothenberg. The execution was carried out in broad daylight, while the victim was waiting for his wife. To Richard's annoyance, members of DeMeo's crew witnessed the act. On the drive back, a driver cut him off in traffic. Richard responded by shooting him in the head at a red light, another murder that went unsolved. Among the most gruesome assignments was the punishment of a man who had raped a 4-year-old girl. Richard tied him to a tree, mutilated him with his own hands, and before killing him, prolonged the agony by inflicting cuts and rubbing salt into his wounds. Finally, with the man still alive, he put a life jacket on him and threw him into the sea, where sharks finished the job. On his way back, another road altercation ended with 3 men shot dead at a rest area. Shortly after, Richard handed DeMeo a plastic bag containing part of the rapist's body, fulfilling the gruesome contract to the letter. New methods to inflict pain. The brutal execution of the rapist not only gave Richard a sense of satisfaction, but also sparked a macabre idea to create his own catalog of tortures. In a notebook, he began jotting down ideas for killing and torturing, drawing inspiration from both films and children's cartoons, from shows like Wile E. Coyote and the Road Runner. He took absurdly cruel concepts, improvised traps, fatal falls from great heights, explosives disguised as gifts, or the use of heavy weights to crush victims. From movies, he learned even more sadistic techniques, such as soaking rawhide in water and wrapping it around a victim's body, then leaving it to dry in the sun, causing unbearable pain. His work knew no borders. He operated anywhere in the United States, and even in Europe and South America. Sometimes he left bodies where they fell. Other times he disposed of them by throwing them into deep pits, feeding them to sharks, or leaving them for hungry rats. Those who owed money to the major crime families could expect that, sooner or later, Richard would come to their door, and the ending was almost always slow and merciless. Sometimes the orders came with very specific instructions for disposing of remains. They might end up in burning oil drums or pressed into compact blocks that, according to him, were sold as scrap metal to the Japanese auto industry. He even claimed that was the final fate of Jimmy Hoffa, though it was never proven. One of his most terrifying methods involved wrapping a live victim in rawhide, leaving them in the sun until the material contracted and cut off circulation, and finally throwing them into a rat-infested area. When he returned to check, only gnawed bones remained. On occasion, Richard filmed his crimes to relive them later. Some of this material was so disturbing that even Roy DeMeo, accustomed to extreme violence, preferred to look away. His invisibility before the law came down to two factors. He worked alone and planned each job with meticulous precision. He always wore gloves, avoided giving his name, and to most, he was simply big rich. Moreover, backing from mob families with police connections shielded him from any serious investigation. By 1976, his body count and his reputation as one of the most efficient killers in the underworld continued to grow unchecked. The fall of a giant and the rise of new opportunities. The death of Carlo Gambino, patriarch of America's most powerful mafia family, shook the foundations of organized crime. Carlo had died of natural causes, but his absence left a void soon filled by his brother-in-law, Paul Castellano. To many within the clan, Castellano wasn't cut from the same cloth. He lacked his predecessor's cold and calculating instinct. That lack of foresight led him to make mistakes, including ignoring signs that the FBI had filled his life with hidden microphones. More work, more blood. With Carlo gone, Roy DeMeo saw the chance to fulfill his oldest ambition, to become an official member of the Gambino family. In the spring of 1976, that dream came true, and with that promotion came an increase in murder contracts. For Richard, it meant an average of 4 to 6 assignments per month. DeMeo's killing machine was feared across the country, and Richard was a key component. DeMeo didn't just eliminate threats, he punished any sign of disrespect with brutal methods. While Richard worked alone, quiet and precise, DeMeo surrounded himself with a crew of drug-fueled, out-of-control gunmen, a combination that would inevitably cause problems. At the same time, Richard and DeMeo had joined forces in the lucrative pornography business. Though publicly everything seemed fine between them, Richard still held a private promise. One day, he would kill DeMeo. The shark menu, and a new poison. It was DeMeo who taught Richard a new way to make bodies disappear. Sharks. Once, in the open sea of Sheepshead Bay, DeMeo accused one of his own men of being an informant. He shot him, dragged him to the rail, and threw him alive into shark-infested waters. Richard was fascinated by the efficiency of that end. Soon after, another contact introduced him to an even more discreet method, poisoning. His old associate, Phil Solimene, introduced him to Paul Hoffman, a man capable of obtaining any lethal substance and explaining how to use it without leaving a trace. Richard chose cyanide. His first victim using this method was Tony Scavelli. He followed him to a nightclub and, moving through the crowd, injected him with a lethal dose with surgical precision. Scavelli collapsed in under a minute. Everyone thought it was a heart attack. Poison became his preferred weapon. No blood, no noise, and minimal risk of discovery. He could administer it in drinks, food, or drugs, even from a tranquilizer dart rifle, an idea he took from a wildlife documentary. Sometimes he sedated the victim to prolong their agony before the final blow. Richard had perfected an invisible murder. And in the underworld, that was worth gold. The Shadow of Jimmy Hoffa. The 14th of February 1975. The most famous and controversial labor leader in the United States, Jimmy Hoffa, disappeared without a trace. His story, marked by deep ties to organized crime, became one of the most debated mysteries of the 20th century. The most widely accepted theory has always pointed to the mafia, but the whereabouts of his body remain unknown. Years later, while in custody, Richard told his own version. He claimed that a hitman named Sal Ruggiero had been the one tasked with eliminating Hoffa. According to him, when rumors spread that Hoffa was talking to the police, the mafia retrieved the remains, compacted them inside a car trunk, and shipped them to Japan as pressed scrap metal. Whether true or not, only Richard knew. And he took the secret to his grave. The Ice Cream Man of Death. Among the strangest characters Richard ever met, few stood out like Robert Prong. He drove around the city in a Mr. Softy ice cream truck. But inside, there weren't just popsicles and cones. There were also grenades, guns, and jars of poison. His specialty was deadly, cyanide mixed with dimethyl sulfoxide, a solvent that seeps through the skin on contact. He applied it with a simple spray bottle, as if watering plants. Prong and Richard shared more than an occupation. They had the same cold-blooded approach to killing. They began collaborating, combining techniques and taking on jobs together for various mafia families. Richard adopted the spray method and added it to his own deadly repertoire. The day a boss fell, Carmine Galante, acting boss of the Bonanno family, had returned from prison more ambitious and dangerous than ever. His out-of-control behavior united the other families against him, something almost unthinkable at the time. Putting a price on the head of an active boss was breaking an unwritten code. At a secret meeting, Roy DeMeo proposed a name, Richard. No one was better suited to carry out a hit of that magnitude. The plan was set in motion. On July 12, at Joe and Mary's restaurant in Brooklyn, Galante was having lunch surrounded by his trusted men. Richard entered, fired with precision and surgical coldness, bringing down the capo. His bodyguards were attacked almost simultaneously by another group of shooters who closed off the scene in a hail of bullets. The next morning, newspaper front pages showed the image of Galante collapsed on the restaurant terrace. For Richard, that hit was his crowning achievement. He stayed silent, went into hiding for a few days, and then, as if nothing had happened, took his family on vacation to Disney World. The George Maliband case. The 1st of February 1980, Richard was driving alongside his business partner, George Maliband, heading toward New Jersey. During the trip, tension boiled over. Maliband made threats against Richard's family, and that sealed his fate. Richard slammed the van to a stop. Without a word, he pulled out a .38 revolver and fired 5 shots into Maliband's chest. The body went limp. Now it was time to dispose of it. His idea was to fit it into a 55-gallon drum, but the victim's size made it difficult. With surgical coldness, he severed the leg tendons to make it fit. The barrel rolled down a slope and came to rest hidden near a chemical plant in Jersey City. Days later, it was found. The blunder was surprising. Richard rarely made mistakes when disposing of evidence. But this time, police had a key lead. Maliband's own brother told them that on the day he disappeared, he had an appointment with Big Rich. It was the first time a murder had been directly linked to him. The John Favara Case. March 1980. An accident changed the fate of one of the most powerful crime families. Frank, the 2-year-old son of John Gotti, future boss of the Gambino family, was struck and killed by a neighbor and family friend, John Favara. Although authorities ruled it an accident, the Gottis refused to accept the verdict. Favara began receiving threats and was beaten with a baseball bat by Gotti's wife when he tried to apologize. On July 20, Favara vanished. Years later, Richard claimed that he and several accomplices kidnapped him as he left work. They took him to a junkyard in East New York, where he was beaten and tortured before being placed into a 55-gallon drum. The body was never found. Many dismissed Richard's confession as bragging, but others believe he told the truth, freezing death. Richard didn't only kill for hire, he also ran a crew specializing in home burglaries. One of his regular buyers of stolen goods was Louis Masgay. The problem was that Masgay became too pushy, pressuring Richard for more merchandise. On the 1st of July 1981, Masgay went to the store of Phil Solimene, another of Richard's associates, carrying money to buy blank tapes. Coincidence or fate, Richard had just dropped off a stolen load there. Solimene called him, and shortly after, Richard entered the store armed. Masgay was in the bathroom. Richard walked in calmly and shot him twice in the head. Then, together with Solimene, he took the victim's money and car. The body was taken to a warehouse with a pit of freezing water. Richard had learned from his friend Mr. Softy that cold could confuse the time of death, so he left the corpse submerged, covered with a tire, wood, and a layer of cement. He thought it was another perfect job, until Solimene, with his loose tongue, began sharing details with Percy House, a member of Richard's burglary crew. That would be the beginning of a much bigger problem. Pat Kane, the bloodhound who never let go. In the offices of the New Jersey State Police, Detective Pat Kane was beginning to piece things together. An informant had given him a lead. A gang of thieves was behind a string of robberies across the state, and one name kept surfacing in whispers: Big Rich. Kane investigated until he identified the members: Danny Deppner, Gary Smith, Percy House, and the leader, the enigmatic Big Rich. Tracking the crew wasn't easy. Except for Percy, the others seemed like ghosts. While Kane closed in on the thieves, Richard, as he would later admit, kept killing. 15 murders, all sanctioned by the Mafia. The bodies disappeared in pieces scattered in garbage containers or in perforated drums dumped into the Hudson, where the crabs took care of the rest. Kane's persistence paid off when he spoke with Barbara Deppner, wife of Danny and lover of Percy House. She gave up the name the police had been chasing for years. Richard Kuklinski, Gary Smith, deadly punishment. Smith had ignored the warning to stay hidden after Percy House's arrest. He wanted to visit his daughter. To Richard, that was disobedience. His punishment was a hamburger laced with cyanide. But Smith didn't die instantly. Richard ordered Danny Deppner to finish the job, and he strangled him with a lamp cord. The corpse was left under the bed of a motel room. For 4 days, other guests slept there, without suspecting anything, until the stench became unbearable. Kane realized he wasn't dealing with mere thieves. The leader was a calculating killer, ready to murder over the slightest offense. Danny Deppner. Forced silence. It wasn't long before Richard learned that Barbara had spoken to police about Smith's death. In his mind, that could only mean Danny had told her, and that couldn't be allowed to live. Richard housed him in an apartment owned by Rich Patterson, the fiancé of his daughter Merrick. Patterson was away, but Richard had the keys. He prepared a beef sandwich laced with cyanide. When Danny collapsed, gasping for air, Richard pulled out his gun and finished him with a shot to the head. When Patterson returned, Richard told him that Deppner had died of an overdose. The body was already wrapped in black plastic bags, ready to vanish. Without asking questions, Patterson helped him leave it near a reservoir in West Milford. Paul Hoffman, the poison master who didn't see his end coming. Paul Hoffman had been the man who taught Richard Kuklinski everything he knew about poisons, but there was never friendship between them, only usefulness. and when Hoffman began pushing too hard to obtain a drug called Tagamet, his fate was sealed. On the 21st of April 1982, Hoffman showed up at Phil Solimene's store with a roll of cash, pretending to want to buy a shipment. Richard and Phil led him to a warehouse, making him believe the goods were stored there. When Hoffman handed over the $25,000, Richard told him it was all a setup. Without hesitation, he placed the gun under Hoffman's chin and fired. The bullet didn't kill him. He tried another shot, but the weapon jammed. Cold and practical, Richard grabbed an iron bar and beat him until he was lifeless. Then he put the body into a 50-gallon drum, filled it with quick-drying cement, and left it in plain sight outside a motel behind a bar called Harry's Corner in South Hackensack. For days, Richard returned to the spot, sitting at the bar, listening to conversations, waiting to hear that the barrel had been discovered. It never happened. One day, it simply disappeared. Paul Hoffman's body has never been found. Roy DeMeo. The settled debt. At the beginning of 1983, Roy DeMeo was cornered. The FBI was investigating him for a long list of disappearances and murders, and the Gambino hierarchy no longer trusted him. In the underworld, that meant his death sentence had been signed. No one knows for sure who killed him, but Richard told his version. When they met, he was surprised to see DeMeo looking frail, as if carrying an unbearable weight on his shoulders. The mobster confessed he was about to be formally charged for the Esposito murders, and his words triggered an alarm in Kuklinski's mind. If DeMeo decided to talk to save himself, he'd go down too. Without giving him a chance, Richard pulled out his gun and fired 5 shots, 2 of them directly to the head. The humiliation he'd carried for years was finally paid in full. With his usual cold composure, he placed the body in the trunk of DeMeo's Cadillac and set a lamp on top, as if it were forgotten luggage. As he walked away, he thought to himself, "The dead don't talk." Robert Prong, Mr. Softy's last mistake. In 1984, Robert Pronge, better known as Mr. Softy, crossed a line that even Richard Kuklinski wasn't willing to tolerate. He asked him to murder his ex-wife and his 8-year-old son. Richard, who never accepted contracts involving women or children, refused outright. But what truly sealed Pronge's fate was something far more disturbing. Richard discovered he planned to poison an entire reservoir with ricin just to kill a single family. It was an act of sheer madness, and Kuklinski decided he couldn't allow such a man to live. On the 10th of August 1984, Robert Pronge was found dead inside his ice cream truck with 2 gunshot wounds to the chest. Kuklinski left no trace. Soon after, he decided to close the warehouse that had witnessed countless murders. Before handing it over, he wanted to retrieve the body of Louis Masgay, which had been lying in the frozen water pit for 2 years. When he pulled it out, he saw the body was so well preserved it looked freshly dead. He wrapped it in black plastic and dumped it in a remote area of upstate New York. But this time, luck wasn't on his side. The body was discovered just days later, closing in. The discovery of Masgay's body was the missing piece in the puzzle. Detective Pat Kane had been assembling for years. With obsessive patience, he had tracked every move Kuklinski made, even following his family's routines. He knew Richard was a mafia hitman, a pornography trafficker, and a man responsible for at least 5 confirmed murders. But Kane lacked solid evidence to arrest him, and he feared that if Kuklinski learned about the investigation, his own family could be in danger. Still, he was determined to continue, even as pressure and lack of support from his superiors drove him toward depression and alcohol. The only option was to infiltrate someone into Kuklinski's inner circle. The choice was Dominic Polifrone, a seasoned agent with a successful record infiltrating criminal organizations. He had the look, the mannerisms, and the confidence of a real mobster. Kane knew the entry point was Phil Solimene, the only man besides his wife whom Richard fully trusted. Convincing him wasn't easy, but a recent arrest and the promise to help his imprisoned son became perfect leverage. Phil agreed, and in 1985 introduced Polifrone under the alias Dominic Provenzano, posing as an old trusted friend. Within a short time, Dominic blended naturally into the local crowd, earning his place within Kuklinski's tight criminal circle. Everything was ready, except for one unresolved detail. Where is Richard? There was a problem. Richard Kuklinski was nowhere to be found. Not even Phil Solimene's insistence calling to tell him he had some good material freshly managed to draw him out. Richard replied that he was too busy. Meanwhile, tension in the mafia world was rising. Paul Castellano, head of the Gambino family, had become a nuisance to many. According to the official version, Sammy Gravano proposed killing him along with his bodyguard, Thomas Bilotti. But when John Gotti heard about it, he took over the plan. Richard, however, told a different story. He claimed that Gravano hired him only to take care of Bilotti, while another team would handle Castellano. Whatever the truth, on the 16th of December 1985, Bilotti drove Castellano to a meeting at Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan. Outside, a group of men wearing Russian-style fur hats waited. Among them was Richard, ready to play his part. The attack was swift and precise. Kuklinski calmly walked away, took a taxi, and collected $30,000 for the job. That night, he sat beside his wife, watching the news coverage of the murder. A year apart. Time passed, and Richard finally agreed to meet with Solimene, but refused to go to the shop. He warned him that the police were watching and advised him to shut it down. Still, Solimene insisted that he meet a man named Dominique Polifrone, assuring him that he could get anything he needed. Richard wasn't convinced but asked if he could get cyanide. Polifrone had been frequenting Solimene's place for over a year, but during that time, Richard had never shown up. He was focused on overseas business and select contracts. So Pat Kane decided to take another approach. He went straight to his house. Richard opened the door, let him in, and listened to questions about 5 murders. He denied everything coldly, though he admitted to knowing Roy DeMeo. When the officers left, his anger grew. How dare they show up at his home? He decided Kane had to die. For weeks, he followed him, waiting for the perfect moment to make it look like an accident. The problem was that he no longer had a cyanide supplier. He had killed the 2 who used to provide it. He then called Solimene again to ask about Dominic Polifrone. Finally, he agreed to meet him at a Dunkin' Donuts, intending to ask him to get the poison to kill Kane. At the meeting, they exchanged phone numbers, and Polifrone offered to move military weapons if Richard knew any potential buyers. 2 days later, Kuklinski called again. He wanted the cyanide as soon as possible. Shortly afterward, he contacted him once more, this time to set up a meeting with supposed arms buyers. The rapid pace of these conversations left authorities with no time to set up proper surveillance. Prosecutor Bob Carroll decided to take charge and named the investigation Operation Iceman. They would no longer try to tail Richard. They knew he was too clever, so they opted to wiretap all his communications, including those of his family. The call that condemned him. In truth, Richard never intended to go through with an arms deal with Polifrone. He didn't like him, and planned to use another man he also despised, whom he called Tim, as part of a setup. The plan was simple: pretend to make a deal, gather both men in one place, and kill them. With this in mind, on the 25th of September 1986, he called Polifrone from a payphone to arrange the details. Polifrone called him back almost immediately. He was fully prepared, hidden microphone, recorder running, and a clear strategy. To everyone's surprise, Richard fell straight into the trap. After discussing the supposed deal with Tim, Polifrone asked to speak with Richard again. Skillfully, he guided the conversation where he wanted it to go. First, Richard agreed to get him silencers. Then they discussed cyanide. Richard explained he would use it to get rid of some rats, and detailed how he planned to apply it in aerosol form so it would be undetectable, boasting that he had used it successfully several times before. When Polifrone asked if he'd take on a few jobs for him, Richard agreed, as long as the pay was good. Before hanging up, he gave him a new pager number. What Richard didn't know was that every word was being recorded, and that he had just provided the key evidence needed to bring him down: the cooling off. Repeatedly postponing meetings with Richard proved counterproductive. Little by little, he lost interest in doing business with Polyphrone. The calls became fewer, the conversations shorter. Soon he stopped answering altogether, skipped scheduled meetings, and decided it was all a waste of time. However, his obsession with killing Pat Kane remained strong, and now he added Polyphrone to his list of targets. He continued traveling frequently to Zurich and killing anyone who stood in his way, but gave up on getting cyanide through Polyphrone, seeking it elsewhere instead. The police were completely unaware of his European trips. To try to trace his whereabouts, Kane and a partner went back to his house. This time, Barbara opened the door. She told them she didn't know where Richard was. The officers explained they were looking for him in connection with a murder case. It was the first time Barbara began to question what her husband really did. She had always assumed his income came from shady deals, but she never imagined it was tied to murder. When Richard learned what the police had told his wife, he exploded with rage. Now, he wanted to eliminate Kane more than ever. The problem was that he still couldn't get the cyanide he needed. The unexpected call. Desperate to obtain cyanide, Richard decided to give Polyphrone another chance. They arranged a new meeting, and once again, Richard spoke freely about methods of killing with poison, how to dispose of bodies by throwing them into deep wells, and even confessed that he had once frozen a corpse to alter the estimated time of death. They also discussed a supposed contract to eliminate a young Jewish drug dealer that Polyphrone claimed he wanted gone. Every word was being recorded. Polyphrone, who already suspected Richard planned to kill him once he received the cyanide, pretended to go further and proposed a detailed plan, using the poison in an egg sandwich meant for the target. Richard agreed to play along, though he had already decided it would be easier to take them both to his warehouse and shoot them. The meeting was set for the 17th of December, 1986. Day. On the morning of the meeting, Polyphrone handed Richard the poisoned sandwich and a small vial of cyanide. According to the plan, Richard would get cocaine for the supposed buyer. Then, they would all meet at a cafe, where he'd serve the deadly sandwich. But something felt off. The vial didn't look or smell right. Curious, he stopped his van, bought a hamburger, spread some of the powder on it, and fed it to a stray dog. The animal ate it without any reaction. That was all Richard needed to know he was being set up. Instead of meeting Polyphrone, he turned around and drove home. The agents surveilling his house weren't expecting him to show up, and when they realized the operation had collapsed, they alerted the rest of the team. Within minutes, up to 15 unmarked vehicles surrounded the area. Richard and Barbara had just gotten into the car to go to the doctor. They had only driven a few meters when they were blocked by the agents. Richard considered pulling his gun but stopped, fearing for Barbara's safety if a shootout broke out. Both were forcibly removed from the vehicle and thrown to the ground. Seeing his wife pushed, Richard lost control and resisted so violently that it took 8 officers to subdue and handcuff him. The fall. The news exploded in the headlines. A mafia hitman who froze bodies and poisoned his victims, dubbed by the press the Iceman. Richard, now in custody, showed no concern for himself, but insisted that Barbara was innocent and unaware of his activities. In his cell, he behaved like a cornered animal, pacing, cursing, and threatening to kill anyone who came near him. The search of his home surprised investigators. No weapons, no evidence, no human remains. Richard had been extremely careful to keep his criminal life separate from his family. Barbara was released soon after, though she was charged with possession of a .25 caliber pistol found under her car seat. Charges and trial. The prosecution filed a list of charges against Richard, including 5 murders, 6 weapons violations, attempted murder, robbery, and failed assaults. Investigations revealed that he held large sums in Swiss bank accounts and had a flight reservation to that country. He was held on $2 million bail and ordered to surrender his passport. During the trial, Several former associates, including Rich Patterson and Domrone, took the stand to testify against him. However, the most damning evidence came from the recordings of his conversations with Polifrone. The defense tried to downplay their importance, arguing that Richard had exaggerated to impress someone he believed to be a high-level criminal. In March 1988, the jury found him guilty of the murders of Gary Smith and Daniel Deppner, but determined there was insufficient evidence to impose the death penalty. To avoid a second trial for the murders of George Maliband and Louis Masgay, Richard agreed to plead guilty. The Paul Hoffman case was dropped since his body was never found. In exchange for his confession and cooperation in locating the remains, authorities removed that charge. As part of the deal, the illegal weapon charge against his wife and a marijuana possession charge against his son were also dismissed. The final sentence was 2 concurrent 60-year terms, with eligibility for parole in 2046, when Richard would be 111 years old. He was sent to Trenton State Prison, where, coincidentally, his brother Joe was also serving time. The Iceman on camera. Once behind bars, Richard agreed to meet with prosecutors, psychiatrists, criminologists, writers, and television producers. From these interviews came 3 HBO documentaries. The Iceman tapes aired in 1992, 2001, and 2003. According to his daughter Merrick, it was her mother who convinced him to participate, and she also received a handsome payment for it. In those interviews, Richard claimed responsibility for far more murders than those included in his conviction, hinting that the number could exceed 200. However, he rarely provided concrete details, such as full names, locations, or dates. He said he deliberately varied his methods to prevent any pattern from being traced back to him. Though he recounted his crimes with chilling detail, many of his statements were never verified and remain in doubt. Death and final years. After Richard's arrest, both his family and his neighbors were shocked. Everyone saw him as a successful, respectable businessman. His wife, Barbara, suspected that some of the money came from shady dealings, but never looked too deeply into it. She preferred to enjoy the comfortable life it provided. She never imagined her husband was involved in an endless list of murders. In 1993, the marriage officially ended, though Barbara claimed it was for financial reasons. Even so, she continued to visit him in prison once a year. In October 2005, after nearly 18 years behind bars, Richard was diagnosed with Kawasaki disease, which causes inflammation of the blood vessels. He was transferred under guard to St. Francis Medical Center in Trenton. Earlier, he had asked doctors to resuscitate him in case of cardiac arrest. However, Barbara had signed a "Do not resuscitate" order. When the time came, the doctors contacted her to confirm whether she wished to reverse her decision, but she refused. On the 5th of March 2006, Richard Kuklinski died of cardiac arrest at the age of 70. Richard was an atypical serial killer. His violent and loveless childhood shaped him. But aside from his explosive temper, he didn't fit many of the usual criminal profiles. He didn't use drugs, rarely drank before a job, and never killed women or children. There were no sexual motivations in his crimes. His greatest weakness was gambling, where he lost fortunes. He killed for hire or simply because someone annoyed him. He took pleasure in others' suffering and even filmed some of his murders to watch later, though those tapes were never found. In interviews, he described his crimes with unsettling calm, as if talking about daily routines, yet many who knew him described him as charismatic and engaging in conversation. Even Barbara admitted she loved the good Richard and hated the bad Richard. The true number of his victims was known only to him. He may have exaggerated to fuel his own legend, but the truth remains. He was a sadistic psychopath. And one question lingers: if he had grown up in a stable, loving environment, could he have become someone different? Thank you for joining us to the end of this dark yet fascinating story. If you liked this video, don't forget to hit like, leave your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you won't miss our next investigations. Turn on the bell icon to get notifications and keep exploring with us the most striking true crime cases.